Hi guys, welcome to another interview with people who are working in the creative side of things, or music and so on. And I am very happy to be joined by a man who's had a huge career as a studio engineer, and he did do production work as well as producer. I'd like to sort of find out about that too later. And it's none other than Phill Brown. Phill, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you very much. Yes, very well, thank you.
Good. Phill, okay, let's start from sort of like the early days because it's kind of a good natural good way to start really. Um, Tell us how you got started in the sound recording business,
Right.
engineering business, and then it ended up being in Olympia Studios in London.
Well, my brother, who's 3 years older than me, Terry Brown, he was working at Olympic when it was in Baker Street. It was in Curzon Street off Baker Street. So when I was about 13, 14, I used to get the opportunity weekends and occasionally to go and sit on sessions. So I watched the Yardbirds record and Peter Proby and various people. And I just thought at 14, 15, I was in a band, loved music, disliked school at that age. And I just thought that seems a better job than working for a living, if you know what I mean. So,
Yeah, it does.
yeah. And then my brother got married quite young, and at his wedding, I was 16, I think, then. And at his wedding, I met Keith Grant, who had just built and opened the Olympic Studios in Barnes.
Yeah.
And I just said to him, if you ever get opportunity, for a gig or something, bear me in mind. And I had met him a few times because of Terry. And a few months later, he just phoned up and said, you can have a month's trial um, at Olympic. So I did a month's trial there, and fortunately got a job. But it was remarkable back then because I joined when it was 4-track, and Keith Grant we did like Dusty Springfield and Leonard Cohen, and he would Nita Harris. He'd have a 50-piece orchestra which he was recording and mixing to stereo on
Yeah.
2 tracks of a 4-track machine live. And it was an amazing education just being around the end of 4-track and around those kind of guys. And then after my month, I got, accepted, and then I got put on the kind of night session, the rock session. So the first session was Traffic. And I met Glyn Johns, Eddie Kramer, and had a brilliant year there. Mostly with Glyn Johns. It was Eddie Kramer and Glyn Johns. And so we worked on Beggar's Banquet and Ogden's Nut Gone Flake and The Move and Steve Miller Band. It was just a remarkable time to
Yeah.
be in Olympic.
Look, now, can you explain to people who may not be familiar with it what a, a tape op actually is? What would be your
Yeah.
duties in that?
Well, in those days, there were no remotes from the desk to run machines and everything. So it literally comes from like tape operator. I would be running the 4-track machine, spooling back, dropping in to repair things, or dropping in on a track, being cued by the engineer, keeping the echo machine, which was also tape, keeping that running, making tea, setting up mics. It was a really good. There's so many tapers. Chris Kimsey was working there with me. Keith Harwood, who went on to work with the Stones. Andy Johns. So we were just kind of 16, 17 years old, and it was an amazing learning curve, learning about the valve mics. But that was our job, was to, run tape machines, make tape, and set up mics.
Yeah, but it's a great way to start. Just get your foot
I
in
think
there.
I think it's the best to get that kind of, because I worked with so many different engineers and producers during that time. And you saw the way different people worked, and everyone basically just borrows ideas, don't they? So, I took certain ideas from working with Glyn. There was other things from Eddie, obviously from my brother, certainly from Keith Grant and his delayed echo plate, which is a classic kind of sound from the 60s and 70s. But it's a great training, and I know the business has changed so much now, so there aren't studios doing those kind of courses. And you got to remember that when I did it, the job didn't really exist. You know what I mean? When I said at school I wanted to be a sound recording engineer, it was like, that's not on my list, you know.
Yeah.
Whereas now you go and do a, a 2 year course, and learn technical. I mean, I know obviously some technical stuff, but I'm not a technical engineer. I hate the whole thing of all over being over technical, and when people talk in those terms. And a desk, I don't know how a desk works. I know the principle, but I can't fix it. And it's partly through being spoiled at Olympic. You had, Dick Swettenham, who was the maintenance guy who built the Helios. You had Clyde Green, who built Cadak eventually. And if something broke, you just kind of gave it to them.
Yeah.
They fixed it, and it was the
Yeah.
same when I got the job at Ireland. We had 4 maintenance guys to run 2 studios. And I didn't have to know how stuff worked. So I was never really lent towards the technical side of things. I've been much more, slightly more emotional, I guess. You know what I mean? It's getting a
Yeah.
film thing, setting up mics the way you think it might be nice, rather than what they tell you to do. Because there's a great story from the guy that did all the Beatles stuff, the engineer at Abbey Road, and back in the late 60s, they had a guy who would position mics and a guy who would operate the tape machines, and the engineer. They all wore different coats, colored coats, and it was very strict union stuff. And it's famous engineer, but one night he moved the mic nearer to a tabla with the Beatles and compressed it because he just wanted to see what that would do. And they recorded that. It's probably on some classic record. And he forgot to kind of move it back to where it had been. So he got found out. And when he came in the next day, and he's doing the Beatles, which means nothing at Abbey Road in the 60s, he got called up to the manager's office, and they said, you're not supposed to be moving mics. You do that again, there's going to be serious consequences. And it's, it's quite amusing that that's one extreme. Olympic was a non-union studio, so was Ireland. So it was very free to just do what you wanted to do.
That's good. Yeah, it's forgive my ignorance, but is Olympic still there? Is it still going?
No, Olympic got bought in probably about 89 by Virgin, and it got kind of completely stripped out inside and rebuilt, which was a great pity because it was a classic kind of room. And it ran for, up until about maybe 15 years ago. And now, ironically, it's been put back to a cinema. So it was a cinema in the 30s. So it's now a cinema. Chris Kimsey is still involved, and it's got beautiful sound systems in there. He's got a studio there. So Olympic is kind of still there, but not as the 3 studios from the 60s and 70s and 80s.
Yeah. So getting on to like when you were there for a while and you're learning your trade, as it were, you happened to be in the studio, I believe, when Jimi Hendrix
right. Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, I was saying
that must mean quite something.
Yeah. And when I said with the Keith Grant sessions, it was all union stuff. So we do 10 to 1, 2 to 5, and then usually 7 till 10, and sometimes 6 till 9. And it was on I assume it must have been a Friday night. It's too long ago to remember. It was either a Friday or Saturday, more likely Friday. And we'd been doing a string session in the evening in Studio One. And I was there at the end, everyone had gone or were just leaving. It was like I was 10, and I was stripping down all the mics and putting away the chairs. That was the tape op's job as well.
Yeah.
And the phone call came through from Eddie Kramer, who was at a party in London with Hendrix. And he said, what's happening in Studio One? So I explained that, I was packing up, and he said, anyone in? I went, no, Studio Two's working all night, but there's no one in one. So he said, great, we're on our way down. And then about 11, there was Dave Mason from Traffic, Hendrix, Mitch Mitchell, Eddie, Brian Jones and his girlfriend. They all turned up for this party. And Noel Redding wrote later in a book of his where he said that, at this party, we're all a bit drunk. They wanted to go to the studio. I thought it was a waste of time. So he never came, which is remarkable, really. And I just helped set up for the drums, the way Eddie does it, and bass. We set up a kind of an acoustic and electric guitar setup. And then the guy that used to do all of Hendrix stuff, the tape op, although he was much more of a tape op, he was a complete boffin, was George Skiantz. And he was he was a 19, 20-year-old tape op there, but he was the guy that did phasing on Itchy Park. That was down to George. You know, he was a boffin with making things. So he used to do Hendrix, and they eventually got hold of him. So about 2 o'clock in the morning, George turned up, and you know, I'd just done a whole day's work or whatever. So although I'm there with Hendrix, and it seems amazing now, I kind of went, right, you know, I'm leaving now.
Yeah.
Bye, guys, you know, because I had to drive home to Watford and sleep, you know. And then about, I think on the Monday, Eddie phoned me up and said, you know, on Thursday we're doing some more stuff on the track. George can't do it, so you know, can you do it? So on that day, we did all the electric guitars in the, you know, especially in the middle with all the pan and stuff.
Yeah.
But it's either so it's Mitch Mitchell on drums, and it's when I left, it was Hendrix on bass and Dave Mason on acoustic. But being that Dave Mason was also a bass player, it's quite possible that during the night, Hendrix might have played the acoustic and Dave Mason played the bass. So I have no actual idea. But when I left, Hendrix was playing the bass. And it sounded amazing in Studio One. I mean, that's one of the things that stuck with me, the sound of that basic track of All Watchtower, the way it stumbles in, and it just blew me away. And I kind of tried to hang on to that feeling, that energy and the spark, you know, for longer than just a few weeks, because it was quite, you know, it was quite an event. It just sounded incredible in there. And he was a really nice guy. You know, he was very shy. Dave Mason I knew because of Traffic, but yeah, it was fun. And yeah, just the right place, right time, you know, which has been my story of my life, because you look at all those people I've worked with, there's so many completely by accident, you know, meeting somebody on the street, or you know, with Robert Palmer, I went down to the island when they were when they moved to Chiswick, and there was a friend of mine, Steve Smith, who was there, and I just popped in, and he was with Robert Palmer. That meeting led to 5-6 years with Robert, doing 4 albums and becoming very, very good friends. But I mean, it was all just by chance somehow. You know?
Interesting. Yeah, it is. How things happen like that sometimes. Just the right place, the right time, as you say.
Yeah, a lot of that for me.
And you know, and contacts that you build up over time. You know, often later on we'll discover this, where artists would call you, want you to come back and work with them again. You know, after long gaps and stuff like that, particularly like Mark Hollis and people like that. You worked, were you kind of like flirting between the two studios, Olympic and then Island, or did you shift from Olympic to Island?
Yeah, I did a year at Olympic, or just over. Then my brother and I both went to Canada, and we built the first 16-track studio in Toronto. I was probably 17, he was 20. And then after a year, I came back. I mean, it was partly to visit my parents, but I came back, and we'd heard about this studio in Basin Street and, you know, Notting Hill Gate that was being built. And I knew Frank Owen, who was there, and Dick Swettenham, but, you know, everyone had moved to, Chris Blackwell stole a lot of the Olympic guys and then put them in, you know, which he admits. I don't think Keith ever forgave him, but so I went in there just to say hi, and got offered a job as a junior engineer. So I stayed here and did 6 years as a house engineer at Highland.
Yeah. And in that time when you were there, one of the bands that came in there was Bob Marley and the Wailers. And I believe a lot of grass was consumed at that time. And you had to be, was it initialized or something, initiated or something by having?
Well, I mean, the thing is, Ireland was quite a druggy studio, if you like, because it was 24 hours. And a lot of musicians hung out there. I mean, Steve Winwood and Chris Wood from Traffic would often be just there in the middle of the night. There was a local Lucky Gordon, who was involved in the Perfumo affair. He was somebody that Blackwell knew. Blackwell brought him in to cook soul food. So he'd be downstairs during the night cooking soul food. We had local that's dope dealers. It's only hash and grass that anyone was really interested in there, but they'd be around. So the island had a bit of a kind of vibe to it anyway. But I did a lot of stuff for Trojan in the early 70s. I basically worked on all the stuff that wasn't island, which was my decision. I wanted to work with all the artists, but preferably not island artists. And that's how I got to work with Jeff Beck and Led Zeppelin and all those kind of people, because I was doing all that stuff. But I slowly got sucked into Ireland. So I did Trojan, and then Jimmy Cliff,
yes,
yeah. Chris Blackwell, he came over with some tracks. So we mixed Many Rivers to Cross, Sitting in Limbo, those kind of things. And then that led on to Bob Marley. Blackwell brought in, it was the second album, Burning, because he did both albums the same way, really. Catch a Fire was done in Jamaica on 8-track, brought to London, put onto a 16-track, extra overdubs, mixed in London, Catch a Fire. And Burning was very, very similar. Tracks have been done in Kingston, and I was one of the lucky guys, along with Tony Platt, that got to work on it. So we'd overdub. One of the things that Chris wanted to do on Burning was to speed up the tracks, because it's kind of roots reggae. The original Wailers in Jamaica was a much slower reggae pulse, really. And Blackwell wanted to get it to a whiter audience, or a wider audience.
Yeah.
He had this idea of speeding up tracks, but because if you speed up the track, you can get away with that. The band sounds tight and the sounds are fine, but you have to redo all the vocals. So we were kind of speeding them up, adding the odd bit of guitar and keyboard, and we recording Bob's vocals and the i3s or whoever was doing the backing vocals, and then mixing. So I got to do that. And your initiation thing, I mean, the thing is that they used to smoke these neat grass joints, which this American, Steve Smith, had termed baseball bats. They were these really big cone neat grass joints. And we had to do an edit on I Shot the Sheriff. And, Studio 2 was a pretty small little room. I mean, it was probably like 10 by 12 or maybe 12 by 15, but it wasn't a big room. And with, these 4 big guys from Trenchtown and Chris Blackwell there, and it was like a lot of people in here. They're all spliffing, dancing, singing, and I needed to concentrate on a 2-inch edit. So I asked them to leave, and as they were leaving, family man Barrett gave me half of one of these cones and went, "Hey, you'll be needing this." So I was only 22 or something, but I was smoking it as I was doing the edit, and it fell apart and burnt the tape or melted the tape.
Oh, no.
So I Shot the Sheriff, which edit should have taken maybe 10 minutes, took about half an hour, but I salvaged it. And no one knew about it. We mixed it, boxes go away into the store, and then in the early, because that was like 75 or something, in the early 90s, I got a phone call from Julian Mendelsohn, who used to work for Trevor Horn, engineer, producer. And Julian phoned up, and all he said, as he picked up, when I answered the phone, hello, he just went, "So what's the story?" And I kind of went, "Julian, what story?" He goes, "I don't get, what's the story with the tape? What's that edit all about?" So I realized, that he'd got it out for some anniversary mix probably, and realized this was not an ordinary edit. So there were things like that. But I did that, the Live at the Lyceum album, mixed that, which was mixed in 6.5 hours, which I couldn't do today. Again, Blackwell, we'd set it up. It was all manual in those days. There was no computers. So you're on a heatless manual desk, 16-track. And we had the audience on tracks 15 and 16. So we set up a track in the middle of the concert, Trenchtown. I think it was Trenchtown Rock. Set that up, and Blackwell was just, they're all dancing, split, and Blackwell just kind of kept calling out, more audience, so you push the audience out, which we then have to adjust your balance because of the PA, more audience. So we got to this point where the audience were like, got to be 40 or something of the mix. And he went, great, let's go back to the top of the concert and just run it off like that. So I was kind of mixing almost like front of house. We didn't do, we didn't run a bit and then go back and put it down. We just went with it from reel to reel to reel, and then edited. So in 6.5 hours, we left with copies. So quite remarkable.
That's really fast. Yeah.
It's outrageously fast. I mean, if you had it today, it would be dumped onto Pro Tools. I mean, you wouldn't mix that in 6.5 hours. It would take you an hour just to get all the Pro Tools working and everything assigned. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Tape was very fast. That was the one great thing about. I mean, apart from the sound of it, you put it on, you arm a track, you record. It's very instant. That kind of analog world, with digital stuff, you've always got to be, primed and ready. And if somebody's playing in a room and you've got a piece of tape on the machine, you can put it into record within seconds. But if there's a band playing in a room and you've got Pro Tools and you need clean tape, as it were, you've got to set up a thing. It takes minutes. So I'll always like the speed of analog.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Now, it's 1986. I'm leaping a wee bit here, and again, as you were saying earlier on, Phill, like you had like sort of like being in the right place at the right time, sort of chance meetings with people, and this occurred with Tim Fries-Green, who of course was the producer with Talk Talk and had a long association with them. Can you sort of give us a little idea of how that chance meeting happened and then how it led to you working on Spirit of Eden?
The 80s were a bit of a tough decade for me musically, and also with all the technology, the early digital and stuff. It took me a while to adjust. I didn't like a lot of it. And so I had some hits with kind of King and China Crisis and this wonderful album I was doing with Paul Roberts from Sniffing the Tears. But I had a different kind of career to the 70s. And in 86, apart from Paul Roberts, I spent about 6 months just not working. So with a family, a wife, a house, all of that, I had to, make some money somehow, And I was about to leave the business, and I was just picking up a tape that I'd done at Wessex for Paul Roberts, and Tim Fries-Green was in the main room, just sitting around on this Bosendorfer smoking a silk cut, and I knew him from the past. We'd worked together on a couple of things, so I just went in to say hello, and we just got talking. I'd just seen Talk Talk tour, Hammersmith Odeon a few months before, which just blew me away. Color Spring, I absolutely adored it as an album. It was probably my album of 86, if not an album of the 80s. And I was just telling him this, it was a bit like just speaking what was kind of coming into your head rather than being in any way manipulative. And I remember just saying, wow, I love that band and congratulations. But I mean, that's the kind of band I should be working with. And it was very much this thing of, I'm not working, I'm offered stuff I don't like, but here's a band I actually adore, And so I left, and about, 2 months later, Tim phoned up and said, were you serious? Come and meet Mark. So I went out to a pub in Stanmore, met Mark, who never talked about music, talked about football, politicians, just, his sarcastic kind of humor that he had. But we didn't talk about music. They never talked about what they wanted to do. And then I did have to get back to Wessex for something that evening. So I said, right, it was an hour or two had gone by. I went, right, I need to head off. And Mark said, could you give me a lift to a railway, to an underground station? So this is kind of rush hour. This is 5 o'clock in the afternoon. This is kind of rush hour traffic, or 4:30. So we're driving back into London. And I'm now a driver, you know what I mean? I'm not at an interview anymore. And Mark was just sitting beside me, and he got just asking me questions then about my background, what what was Jimmy Miller like, because that was a huge hero of his. I only found this out later. And then he said, "Oh, you can drop me at this station." As I pulled up, let him out. He said, "So what sums up Olympic for you?" And I said, November 1967, 1 a.m.
Yeah.
And he smiled and just left, and that was it, And then when I got working with him, I found out that he was a massive fan of Traffic. They were his kind of heroes, and I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but we did work on Spirit of Eden as if it were in pitch blackness, so it was like 1 o'clock in the morning, all the time. Lights went out at 11 in the morning, came back on at 11 at night when you were going home. So that's how I got to meet Mark, and I spent 13 years with him after that. Big gaps, like you said, in between. But
yeah, there were several years. Yeah. And that led to it led to Spirit of Eden, which is now, I don't know how it was received at the time, but now in hindsight, it's been regarded as a classic album.
I know.
By many, and really revered, and it's influenced a lot of artists since.
Yeah.
But how was it received at the time, Phill? Was it panned by
mixed stories? Really, the thing is, working on the album, we wouldn't let anyone in to the studio. So obviously, musicians came in, but we didn't talk to them. We're in the dark, and that went on for almost a year. And if the record company turned up, we would then kind of come down and like usher them out the door, take them up the pub for a couple of drinks, come back. And then when we got to the door, when they thought probably I'm going to go in now and hear something, we go, "Great to see you, bye." So we weren't that helpful to the record company. But I mean, I mixed stories, but from what I've heard, majority is when they heard the album, they were distraught because they didn't think there were singles on Color of Spring. Color of Spring is just like this insane pop record, isn't it? It's classy and it's out there, but it's pop music. They're pop songs. So Spirit of Eden was not regarded that well by EMI, but it had great press in the the Telegraph, the Guardian, that kind. I wouldn't say the music press, but definitely kind of the main tabloids gave it a good write up, and it sold. Color of Spring sold 2 million, I think, in excess. Spirit of Eden sold about 500,000 at the time, so hardly a failure, but wouldn't have recouped the unbelievable amount of money it cost to make.
Yeah.
And then they left at EMI, we went to Polydor. We basically went through exactly the same relationship with them. We gave them Laughing Stock, and they hated that. So it was kind of weird. It's nice, obviously, in the last few years to see how those albums are now being received and all the things that have been said. But had perhaps us all had a slightly more positive thing at the time, who knows? Mark might have stayed in and carried on making music. Who knows? We would have all probably had very different kind of careers. Because for Tim Freeze Green and I, it did us a lot of damage, Spirit of Eden, initially, because we got a reputation for being slow and expensive. And the annoying thing was that most of my career, I was making albums really cheaply. And I mean, I've made albums in 2 or 3 days, and 2 weeks. I mean, I was not one of those that sat there, moving a hi-hat around for 5 hours. That's, like I said earlier, I'm just not into all that technical perfection. I want something that just has energy and, just sets you afire, whether it's a ballad or a rock song. So because Spirit of Eden had taken nearly a year and it cost, I don't know, 350,000 or whatever it was, it didn't do Tim and I much good at the time. Within the business, not within musicians. I mean, I was about to leave in '86. Spirit of Eden completely reinvented my career, because from the 90s on, all through the 90s, I mean, it led to me working with Dido. It led to me working with Faithless and Dido, Rollo, all because of Spirit of Eden. Midnight Choir, which is a wonderful Norwegian band. the Walkabouts, a band from Seattle. I mean, I've worked with so many people, and when you finally kind of went, so why did you ring me up? You know what? They went, Spirit of Eden. It was always Spirit of Eden. A band in Buenos Aires. You know, I've been all over the place, Japan, working with people, not trying to make talk records at all. You know, they're all very different kind of things. Midnight Choir is the nearest to that kind of atmosphere, but it's still nothing like talk. So that, yeah, it brought me a lot of work. But in the business, the music business, as opposed to musicians, it was had a negative effect, I'd say, you know, until the last few years when it suddenly has been re-released, some of them badly. Might be to do with Mark dying. I think they were picking up a year or two before that happened, to be honest with you. And it's brilliant. I mean, I love the fact that Spirit of Eden's class is a classic. I mean, it's 34 years old or something now.
Yeah, amazing. It really is. It stood up really well.
Yeah,
it really has, because it doesn't really sort of. It's one of those albums that doesn't seem to define the era in which it was made.
That's why,
and that's the reason I think why it's become kind of out of time, as it were. You know,
if you think of the sounds of the 80s, the kind of records that are coming out in the 80s, which is why probably in 87 or whatever, when this was, you know, given to EMI, they must have gone, what, you know, the drums don't sound like Duran Duran, and it's not a 80s record. But it had no time even then. It's hard to know whether it was recorded in the 60s, which it could have been, last week. You know what I mean? It's completely out of time, which is why I think it still holds up. Doesn't sound dated. And I think it's true that each time you hear it, or you hear other things in it that you perhaps haven't heard before, or they came to the fore somehow. Because, I mean, I don't listen to any of those things very often, but I mean, I have heard things on Spirit of Eden that I hadn't heard since I was in the studio 30 years ago, quite recently, on a set of Flare headphones and speakers. There's amazing hearing, you know, headphones system. And I heard things then that I hadn't heard for 30 years. It was like, wow, you know, I remember that. But there's some subtleties in there. You know?
Yeah.
Laughing Stock, I don't listen to really at all. Which I know some people, when they vote, which is an impossible thing, you know, for albums, but a lot of people on Facebook and stuff seem to like Laughing Stock often more than the Spirit of Eden. But yeah, I mean, it was hard to make that album, and it's just a bit too dark for me. That's how I perceive it. It possibly isn't.
Right. Okay. Yeah. It's in reference to Spirit of Eden. But there are many songs that resonate with people on an emotional level. And I got to admit that the track I Believe in You really did resonate. I found that really very heartbreaking, actually. And with the choir in it and everything, it just was otherworldly by the end of it. I just wondered what songs it could be from. It could be from a Talk album or any other albums you worked on, or just personal taste. Is there a particular song that resonates with you in an emotional way, that hits hard when you hear it?
Well, I think I did this album with John Martin in the late 70s, where it was by chance, but we managed to have a PA system, and we were out at Chris Blackwell's house, which is surrounded by an old disused gravel pit. So it's surrounded by water, and we pumped this PA out over the lake and pumped John's guitar through it. And there's a track called Small Hours, and off the One World album. And I know Black was also kind of chosen it, but it's just so amazing because it is from another world. You know, it's 4 o'clock in the morning and you've just got this guitar hovering around with the sound of water and the sound of animals, because it seemed to attract a lot of wildlife. So that is one of my kind of favorites, I guess, just because it is really special and it's calming. And there's very little on it. It's just John with a guitar with effects and repeats and a bit of Steve Winwood Moog and Danny Thompson on bass. You know, there's 3 people, I think, but it is just, yeah, it just floats. It's beautiful. And I do agree with you. I mean, I think I Believe in You was a great track off that album. And we did do it actually with a big choir originally. We did have a 25-piece adult choir come in, and it was quite remarkable. Obviously, you can imagine the power of something like that.
Oh,
But
yeah.
the next day, when we played it back, Mark, in his kind of humor, he just said, "Oh, it sounds like the Cliff Adams Singers," which were these kind of easy listening records from the 60s and 70s. Erase it. So we just got rid of this adult choir and we brought in the kind of 6 sort of young lads. But it was yeah, it was I mean, that album was kind of a fun album to work on in a way. I mean, it was completely different for all of us. I don't think any of us had worked on an album like that, because Color Spring had been done with the what's that? It's a synthesizer that Tim Freeze-Green had. It was about 100 grams worth of digital recorder, and Color Spring was made on that. So a lot of it it's more digital than you would imagine.
Was it the Fairlight you're thinking of?
Fairlight, thank you.
Fairlight, yeah.
Yeah.
Not many people had them at the time because they were so costly.
So costly, and again, quite time consuming. But the Spirit of Eden was done with tape, so we were offsetting and moving things around. So like today with, you know, Pro Tools cut and paste and constructing things, we were doing that, but we had to do it in real time. And because we had no screens and we were in the dark anyway, everything had to be done by feel. So, you know, Mark would kind of go, you know, I want it there, and we'd clock the SMPTE code on different machines and put in offsets, and things would all move, and eventually we'd end up with it in that location. But it's very time consuming. But it was kind of exciting because none of us had ever really done anything like that before. I mean, I had 5 24-track tapes, you know, for each song. So we had hundreds of analog tracks. So it was kind of unique kind of way to work. We carried that through to Laughing Stock as well. But we tried not to see on Spirit of Eden drums. We used one of these Neumann stereo heads. So the mics are just the stereo head is the kit, as if you're standing in front of it, really. Bass drum, a snare, and a couple of these contact mics. When we came to do Laughing Stock, the rule was we mustn't repeat ourselves.
Yeah.
That's tough, you know, when you've worked on something that was so out there anyway and different. And we learned so much doing that. To say, well, you can't repeat stuff, you know, was like, whoa. So drums on Laughing Stock is just one. Well, it's 2 mics. It's a Neumann 47, which is a beautiful old valve mic that's about 28 feet away from the drums, and a bass drum mic, which we had to kind of offset again to make it in time. So we never repeated ourselves at all with that, and we started to mic things even further away, because we got into that on Spirit of Eden, but on Laughing Stock that was pushed even more, you know. And then when you fast forward to Mark's solo album, we just used 2 mics for that whole album. They were just 2 mics sitting there, as if you're sitting in a chair in front of those musicians.
Yeah.
We put the mics up and they never changed. So if something came in and was loud, it was loud, and if it was quiet, it was quiet, you know, because that's what this band would have sounded like. So
Yes.
that's what, if you play that album at a kind of lowish, you know, a real level for acoustic instruments, it sounds like you're in the room, because basically that's what you're hearing. You're hearing the room and the musicians in different locations. You had to move them in the room where we wanted them on the stereo, you know. So if we wanted something at 3 o'clock, he had to go and stand at 3 o'clock. And
yeah.
they had marks on the floor with their names on and stuff. So all of them were just very adventurous, very different, which from an engineering point of view was just fantastic.
I bet, because it was something that you weren't used to up to that point of that
Totally.
that way of recording and you
Yeah.
know, and those techniques and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I brought in, you know, lots of that. When we started working Spirit of Eden, we were working with old gear from the 60s, and in a way, I brought in a lot of those techniques that I'd been taught in 1967 with miking and placement and just that whole approach, as if you've only got 4 tracks, you know, but we had unlimited. But we used a lot of that old school way of thinking along with very high tech stuff going on, you know.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, from an engineering point of view, it was amazing to walk in on a project in the 80s, especially, and basically be told, you know, we've got no time restraints. It's just, you know, we will do it, work this way until it's finished, kind of thing. That was really rare. Because albums in the 80s always cost about 100 grand. You know, they weren't cheap to make in the 80s. Studios were 1,000 a day, I think.
Yeah.
We paid about, I think we were paying 12 or 1,400 a day at Wessex because we had all these tape machines and the Mitsubishi, and it was, you know, for them quite high tech. So yeah, it was a different way to work, very refreshing. And say they gave me a free hand to experiment with mics and with ideas. And you know, Tim's an engineer and producer, so he would have things. You know, Mark didn't talk really in technical terms, but he would say things that you would then, you know, transcribe, and we'd experiment with that. We tried loads of things out. I mean, that's why it took so long.
How about the other guys from Talk Talk?
Lee and
Paul Webb on bass and Lee Harris on drums. How were they to work with? And did they have a lot of creative input initially in the albums?
It's a really tricky one.
Studio?
Yeah, I think they did on the previous albums. I think when it got to Spirit of Eden, it somehow became very much Mark and Tim's. Whether, you know, they'd written it, they were performing it, they were producing. You know what I mean? It was so it was different for them. Paul left after Spirit of Eden. That's when he kind of really, I think he said, you know, I think I've done everything I could possibly do. You know, so he left. There was an input from them, but it's very hard to explain those kind of sessions, really, because there was a lot of humor and a lot of, you know, good times, but there was also this undercurrent of, you know, of darkness, and we were in the dark. Mark's humor, although it can be funny, can be really tough. You know, it's a I mean, his big thing at the time was just to say, "Oh, you really are," and it was his way of saying, you know, "You really are," but without saying it, yeah, because that was his favorite word for years. So, you know, if things weren't going right, or if somebody messed up or something, he'd just hear this voice in the darkness just go, "Oh, you really are," and it's funny, but it's also after a year, you know. And Paul had a tough time, I think, and definitely on, you know, so he left, and on Laughing Stock, I think Lee had a really tough time getting those drum tracks down because they just wouldn't, you know, we were just doing so many takes, you know, and they were all so consistent, and it was trying to find out what Mark was actually looking for, because I mean, he's not the most open to explain himself. You know, a lot, it's all going on in here, and he gives you the minimum amount of information sometimes to just follow something through. So Lee was playing these tracks, and I don't think he got the feedback. It's still like, well, why is that one no good and this one is kind of possible, when to me they feel almost identical? You know, it was that kind of thing. So we did that for quite a few weeks to get the drum tracks, and then after Laughing Stock, you know, that was the end for Lee, really, as well. It was actually the end of all the relations. Well, Lee and Paul are still good mates, and I left after Laughing Stock. Paul, Lee, and I built Orang studio and did the Orang album. So, and I still worked or helped Paul with his Rusty Man albums, and I worked on the Beth Givens album. So Lee, Paul, and I have always, you know, hung together somehow now. But after Laughing Stock, it all started, I think, to unravel. Tim and Mark eventually just kind of parted ways, and then the various people started to part ways from the manager, Keith Asburn, and, you know, so it was just that parting of the ways. So when I worked with on the acoustic album or his solo album, there was pretty much just Mark myself and Keith at that point, you know.
Yeah. Now working on uh, Mark's solo album. Now that of course there was a period of time where I think he was more and more getting. I think he said not too much in interviews because he didn't do many, but
Yeah,
I think it became quite apparent that he was becoming quite disillusioned with the music business
yeah.
and
Oh yeah.
wanted out. And then there was several years between Laughing Stock in his solo album, but he was
Yeah.
it was a contractual thing, wasn't it?
When he signed to Polydor in 91 or whenever it was, once they left EMI, he signed to Polydor. It was for a 2-album deal. So Laughing Stock was the first one, and then there was another one due, the solo one. I mean, neither of them probably lived up to what Polydor had hoped at the time. But I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about Talk or Mark Hollis within record companies, because I think they always think they can kind of mold him or get that hit out of him that they want, whereas Mark, I think from Colours of Spring, I mean, he's always, I think, had a reputation for doing it his way, but from Colours of Spring, with the money that they made from that, the tour, I think it gave him that confidence to just like really push home what he really wanted to do rather than just more of this, 80s pop.
Yeah.
So Spirit of Eden, obviously a shock to a record company. Laughing Stock, even bigger shock. But the acoustic album, again, it can be difficult at times, certain parts of it, but it's a beautiful album, and it's all acoustic instruments, because we did record a Hammond, but in the end we never used it in the mix because we came to that conclusion, like everything's acoustic, so why have this one electronic instrument, if you like?
Yeah.
So it was all just natural instruments, recorded in this room with just 2 mics, and a good album for Mark to say kind of bye, I mean, we were working together, because although he wanted to pull away from being an artist himself, he was still totally up for doing things. We were going to produce other artists. So the only thing we actually managed to do was 2 tracks with Anya Garbarek. But there was a possibility of Mark and I joining forces and just producing people. But
Right.
I think eventually after the Andy Garbarek, which was fine to do, but I think he just went, no, I'm just going to stop and be with my family and not have to deal with all. It's a circus, the music business has always been a tough business, but in a way, since Universal brought everybody up in the 80s and 90s, I mean, it's a different kind of business now, and it is dissolute. I mean, I am the same, I had a love-hate relationship for 50 years, it can be, being in the studio with a bunch of musicians making a record is just one of the best things in life, I was so passionate about that, but all the other stuff you have to deal with,
Yeah.
managers and A&R guys and record companies and people's opinions about what's happening at the moment. They're never right. You go back through history, the guy that turned down the Beatles, well, guitar bands are dead, it's like, yeah, got that right. That just follows itself through the business. They've turned down some amazing people. And yeah, it's easy to fall out of love with it. And I think Mark wanted to be at home with his family, and he'd kind of done it, if you know what I mean. And he had them. See, the thing is, if I had had that kind of money when I was, what would it have been, like just before 50, if I'd had that kind of money in my 40s, I probably would have stopped as well, because you've got the money to live.
Oh, yeah.
So why put, apart from making records you really want to make, why put yourself through this?
True. Very true. Yeah.
But
do you know if he had, in that length of time when he did his last album and just sort of like retired, kind of, sort of, as you say, wanted the time with his family. In those intervening years, do you know if he was still recording anything?
he did do, I mean, the thing is, he had a beautiful piano at home, he had beautiful guitar, acoustic especially. I'm sure that he would have been writing and doing stuff himself for himself. He did get involved in a couple of film projects which never materialized. He did music for them, but it never happened in the end.
Yeah.
So I mean, I can't believe that Mark would have, put the cover over the piano and put his guitars in a case, and then just kind of gone, right, kids, what are we going to do today?
Yeah.
Obviously that would have been his life forever. But so I know he was involved in trying to do some film music, and there's one little snippet of something, a piano thing that he did do, and he did a piano thing for me on a installation I was doing. I worked with the guitarist and singer from a band called the Shy Reptiles, which is a northern band from the 80s that I worked with. And in the 90s, we got together. He'd taken up art, painting and doing really wild things with different formats. And we decided to put on some installations. So we did an Edinburgh Festival and various things. But I mean, he and I would do the music and get a soundtrack, and then we'd set it up with all these visuals. And Mark really liked the idea of that, so he asked if he could get involved. And he did a piano track, which he recorded at his house, which was part of our installation and came out on the album called AV1. But yeah, I'm sure he did something. I mean, he definitely would have played or tinkered about. I can't believe that he just stopped. I know he got a motorbike.
Did he have it? Did he have his own, by that point, did he have his own recording equipment at home? Did he have a kind of like studio set up? Or?
Well, he didn't have a studio as in the way that people have home studios now. But when I went up he was living in Suffolk just before we did his solo album, and he asked me to go up and he wanted to play this stuff. And he played me pretty much. See, Spirit of Eden, there were no demos that I ever heard, no talk of any of how the songs were going. It all seemed as if we were on day one making up as we went along. It turns out there were some structures that Tim and Mark had, but they never told anyone about them. So when I went up to see him in, I guess it was 97 or 6 or something, he played me the full album of his solo album, only instrumentally, and it was all made on Logic. And he'd used samples and basically played everything himself, as it were, with a keyboard. And so he had the technology of being able to record at home, but he didn't have a proper studio. He just had this beautiful house with a lovely piano in it, and some good mics. I set him up with some mics, so he could record at home to a fairly good level if he wanted to.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I was going to ask you actually. Studio technology's changed over the years. Like these new things like Pro Tools and things like that. And I wondered, you've seen those changes a lot. Obviously working in the studio for so many years. So when the advent of digital came along, did you adapt to that very, very easily, or were you kind of like still missing analog?
It took me a long time to adapt to digital for lots of reasons. There was an article written about 25 years ago by this American producer, but his basic gist was that technology, we've always accepted new technology, even if there's a loss in quality. So you think 4-track on 1/2 inch becomes 8-track on 1 inch. So the ratio is the same, and even 16-track on 2 inch, all of that, to that point, it was the best quality you could get. And then because, we wanted more tracks, it was 24-track on 2 inch, and there's a definite sound loss on 24-track to 16.
Yeah.
And if you follow it all the way through, so early 80s, the early digital stuff was pretty rough. I mean, there were a few nice things that survived, like AMSs and lexicons that everyone ended up using, but there was a lot of very unpleasant digital and kind of 8-bit stuff. And I didn't walk to it well, no. I loved tape. You still used a lot of tape in those days because in the 80s, you tended to use two analog tape machines synced together. So you had 46 tracks. All your digital stuff tended to be in samplers and drum machines and things like that. They're all synced up. So some things were recorded to tape, some things might run live. But it was just all the echoes, the reverbs, a lot of that stuff had all started to become digital,
Yeah.
But the desk, really, the SSL, that was still an analog desk, and you still needed an analog tape machine. Then they brought out the Mitsubishi 32-track digital, you still recording to tape, but you're recording it digitally. The only difference is that it's quiet, you know. But I miss what tape does, you see, even now. I mean, I still try and use tape, but I mean, say I haven't used it that often now for maybe 15 years. I miss what you get from tape. I miss the drum sound you get from tape, where the tape compresses the drums. See, when you go back to Ireland and Olympic, we had no outboard gear really. We had four compressors at Ireland, and I think 2 gates and a harmonizer. That was it, you know. So because you had tape, the drum, you could push the level on tape if you wanted to. The drums compress even more. But because the tape compresses, you didn't need compression. And now I notice when people are working on Pro Tools, like nearly every channel has a compressor on it, because they're kind of trying to get under control what tape would do automatically, which is get rid of these transients. So I still love tape. I mean, it's by far for me the best kind of format, and its range is larger than digital. You know, the digital is 2020, whereas analog is much higher and even lower. So no, I didn't warm to it particularly well, which is probably why I had a tough time in the 80s, because I didn't like a lot of the sound of records that were being made, you know. It was different for me in the 90s when you had samplers and tape machines and good digital by then, or better digital, and Junos, and working with Rollo, we'd have things running live. It was analog and digital. It was just a great decade for me. I love the 90s because there was a fusion of all this stuff. But the 80s became a very kind of, you work a particular way. And I think there was I just didn't like a lot of those sounds. But I mean, if you gave me a choice today between a Pro Tools rig and a Studer A800, I'd take the Studer and make my records on 24 tracks. You know, you don't need 100 tracks. We've just all become very used to it.
Yeah.
And I don't like auto tuning, and I don't like putting people in time. You know, I actually want what people do. So, you know, if you did that to all those great drummers in the past, Richie Hayward and, you know, Gadd and all those kind of people, if you started to chop them about like you do on digital and put them, you know, it'd be a completely different vibe that you'd get from those guys. So I like what those guys do. I like what musicians do rather than what a record company or what a producer might think he wants. So things are messed about far too much tuning, too much timing.
Yes.
And too many plugins on stuff. You know, it's unnecessary. Just get great sounding instrument in the room, you know, get the right mic on it, and just don't mess about too much in that process between that and getting it onto either digital or tape. Because the other thing about Spirit of Eden, we didn't use EQ on either of those albums. We weren't. That was one of the rules, really. You know, you can't use EQ. So you would Tim and I would put up like 5 microphones of different, you know, his choice, my choice, for something that Mark might like, a couple of random ones, and then we just A/B all the time, you know. So the instrument plays, and we go, well, that's too bright, get rid of that, you know, that's, you know, and you eventually come down to 2, and then you get it down to 1, and then you fine tune that. So it might take you 3 hours to set up a sound. I mean, that was again the way, but we were trying to get things at source and not EQing. And it's, you know, that's quite hard sometimes because it's so easy to EQ something and kind of move on. Well, I wouldn't do that. Yeah, that's sorted. But Mark is a perfectionist, really. So he wanted the sound in the room and a mic, and to give him what he was after, not with technology. Complete contradiction.
How would he? Just curious. How would Mark lay his vocals down toward the end of the sort of like day, or the culmination of all the instruments first, and then do his vocals, or would he?
Yeah.
How would it be? How would he sort
of
do that?
All the tracks were recorded as instrumentals. There were no vocals, no guide vocals. There were no even any lyrics lying around for the first, say, 7 months of the album. And then he, you know, eventually when he got the tracks, he was obviously thinking about lyrics all the time because he often wanted lengths of songs changed, you know, because we worked in this kind of rather experimental way with people improvising and things. Sometimes you had sections which felt great, but then when you came to write lyrics and things, it was too short, too long. So we would then edit or, you know, expand. But the vocals came right at the end. They were virtually the last thing we recorded.
And how many takes, generally speaking, would he do?
Well, no one at all was allowed more than 8 takes, whoever they were,
Right.
across both, well, all the albums really, but mainly Spirit of Eden and Laughing Stock. You got a maximum of 8. If Tim and Mark thought that they had it all sorted in 5 or 6, they might kind of go, yeah, we're cool, you know. But most of the time we did 8. With Mark's vocals, I'm not sure we ever quite got up to 8. I think it was probably, you know, maybe 5, 6 vocals. And then comped between those vocals, you know, made to make the master vocal, if you like. So we could still steal things from different takes. But it was all done, yeah, I prefer that line. But we weren't taking syllables like people do now with Pro Tools. But it was the last thing, and it was actually very relatively easy to do, to be honest. It was, you know, he didn't have to go through any psyched up thing. You know, a lot of the time he just sat at the piano and had the mic and just sang.
Yeah.
And we just did, say, 4 or 5, maybe 6 takes, comped, move on. He might come back, do it, and have another go at a few things, but the vocals were pretty easy to do after how difficult some of the actual recording of the instruments had been. The vocals were actually pretty easy.
Yeah. Now, of course, Mark passed away in 2019, and that shook a lot of people. It certainly shook me. It kind of just, I couldn't quite believe it, because he was a young man, really, you know, relatively speaking, a young fellow.
60s, yeah.
64, I think, or something. Yeah. I'd like you now, Phill, if I may, to sum up your thoughts about Mark. What would you like to sort of say in his memory and so on?
Yeah, well, he's, I mean, he was, yeah, no one quite like him, really. I mean, he could be difficult. I mean, he was so focused on what he was trying to do that he very rarely would take no for an answer, and he would plow on kind of regardless and get the way he wanted it, which you can admire him for. It also means that trying to work with him at times was really difficult for musicians more than for me, but it was hard when people are kind of, you know, he's not telling you what he wants. That's the other thing. So it's that. So but he was pretty unique. I mean, a bit of a genius, and I had a lot of laughs with the guy out of kind of work environment. And you know, I was in touch with him in the autumn of 2018, and he never let on to me at all that he was ill. You know, we were talking about some stuff, and he never had it. You know, never kind of, well, I'll give it a couple of months and then I'll see where I am. He was just talking as if he was fine. You know. And I think he'd had a bit of a reprieve, but then he died very fast in the January or February or whatever of 19. So it was so quick for having talked to him. But no, he was an intriguing guy. I mean, obviously missed him. I was shocked like you. It was like, really? How can that be possible?
Yeah, it just seemed to come out of the blue. You know, it was.
Yeah.
Because
Well,
none of us had any, like you, that had no idea that
he's an incredibly private person, you know. So I doubt. I mean, even Paul didn't know. You know, he never told anyone. So he didn't tell his closest friends. Probably just his wife and kids were the only ones, and probably his manager who actually knew what was going on. You know.
Yeah.
But no, he's yeah. I mean, his music, fortunately, has now been kind of accepted, or at least these last 2, because I say that the early ones were successful. But having Spirit of Eden suddenly become regarded as a bit of a classic album, I think is brilliant for Mark, and I think he would be smiling at that right now. It's like, what kept you so long? You know, why did it take 30 odd years? But yeah, I mean, I don't think we would have probably ever worked together again. But for 13 years, you know, I had a very interesting experience with that guy. And the fact that he gave you all this freedom, a bit like Chris Black would give you enough rope to hang yourself. You know what I mean? It was like, hey, let's try this, you know.
Yeah.
And he was very, very patient as well. You know, if something took 6 hours to do, he was quite happy to either be there quietly for 6 hours or go and watch a football match and come back. You know what I mean? He was he never pushed people to work faster than they would than the natural way of this needed to be. You know, so I kind of miss him from that point of view. But yeah, he was a bit special, definitely.
Oh yeah,
And I
absolutely.
love, you know, how people can say about his voice. When you go back and read some of the press that he got back in the early 80s with the first 2 or 3 albums, the music press was pretty harsh to Talk Talk. You know, they were, you know, they were always being compared to Duran Duran and things like that.
Yeah.
And it's like, you know, yeah, it's okay, this single, but it's not Duran Duran. And his wimpish vocals and all this kind of, and I mean, he breaks your heart. That's the thing. When I listened to Color of Spring, which is when I really got into Talk Talk, it was just like, wow, this guy, this is something else, you know. And then, so being with him for 30 years and just seeing how, I mean, it seems so effortless. And I know he's not singing out strong, and he on those albums and even on his solo one, he's trying to sing as quiet as he possibly can. That was one of the tricks that we did with the Talk Talk thing, was to open the mics up very wide open, you know, quite loud, turn instruments up in the room loud, and then
Yeah.
try and play as quiet as you can. And that's how you got these kind of mad dynamics, things that just kicked out of nowhere. And he sang the same way. He sang just his voice was just about functioning, you know.
Yes. Yeah.
So he was unique. I mean, I can't, out of all those people I work with, I cannot say, oh, he's like so and so. You know what I mean? He was a complete one-off.
He was, and I did like his voice a lot. I think
Yeah, me
I
too.
think it's understated that you know how good a vocalist he was.
Yeah,
And again, like a lot of these people that come along just now and again, um, instantly recognizable vocally. I think
yeah,
I don't think there's anyone else that quite sounds like him.
no,
You know, and that's kind of rare. You know, you get a few artists like that when you listen on the radio, you go, oh no, I know who that is singing.
yeah, yeah.
And I
I
think
think it was
Mark had that
easier.
quality as well.
Yeah.
You know,
It was easier in the past, I think, because of the technology being that you recorded what the person sounded like. I think
mm,
it was easier then to kind of go, oh, it's Neil Young, you know, it's Joni
yeah,
Mitchell. You could hear their voice immediately. Whereas now, with all the technology and the fact that everyone's using the same technology, a lot of them the same mics, same plugins, the same treatments, a lot of the voices just sound so similar. So, I mean, what I don't understand is you take somebody like Adele, who has this amazing voice, and they still put her through all this treatment. So her
yeah,
voice still sounds kind of artificial somehow. And it's just like, why do you do that with somebody who's got naturally a great voice? So,
not needed. No,
you know, the technology and the way it's used, and it will always be like this. You know, when we were working, like the guy at EMI, you know, when we were working back in that era, I'm sure the older engineers saw some of the things we were doing and kind of went, wow, why would you want to do that? You know what I mean? But I guess now that I'm in my 70s, looking back on it and listening to modern stuff, and I'm thinking the same really. Why do you want it to sound like that?
yeah, yeah. I wonder too. It doesn't make sense to me.
I
Um,
like things to be kind of real
yeah,
um, and emotional. You know what I mean? I'm not really into, said before, I'm not really into this kind of perfection and gloss. It's all too plastic for me.
yeah, I agree. Well, Phil, it's been a pleasure talking to you. By the way, I really appreciate your
Okay,
time
thank you.
and sharing your insights into recording processes and the artists you work with. Some of them, of course, we couldn't get through all of them because it's you have worked with so many people. But I hope I picked a few that were
Sure.
people enjoy, you know. And I know that Talk was a big part of your life, you know. So that's why I focused a wee bit more on that. And of course, also because I'm a bit biased, they are one of my favorite bands as well. So, but it's
Yeah,
lovely to get your your thoughts on that.
and
Yeah,
I think also, I mean, I think Talk Talk had an effect on all of us that worked on it and the band themselves. You know, everyone got very involved kind of with emotional stuff and chaos going on outside, because we were such a little bubble making those records, you know. So there was a stress on relationships, you know. I mean, Tim ended up getting divorced, and I ended up to do Laughing Stock. I actually left home and moved into a flat in London to make that record, because there was no way that anyone really wanted me um, around when I was in that mode of making those records, you know. So all of us went through a lot of stuff that's very personal and private and outside of just making a record, which is
Yeah.
always intriguing. Records that have a very wide, you know, impact on all those people making the record. That's much more than just in the studio. So it's interesting. They'll always be with me because of that alone, I think.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well,
But
Phill,
no,
thank you
great.
so
Thank you
much.
so
I
much.
really appreciate your time.
Cool.
And thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoy this. And I'm sure we'll be back with more interviews in the future. Until then, take care, guys, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Brilliant. Bye.